Rain came down hard on London. The morning, everything changed. It hit the cobblestones like it had something to prove. It soaked the black coats of the men gathered outside St. Bartholomew's Cathedral. It ran down the stained glass windows in long silver rivers, and inside, beneath a ceiling high enough to swallow voices whole, Duke Henry Montclair stood at the altar with his jaw tight, and his hands clasped behind his back. He was not nervous. He refused to be nervous. A man who had already lost everything did not tremble over a wedding. The cathedral was full. Every row packed with London's finest, men in tall hats, women in silk and feathers, all watching the doors at the far end of the aisle with barely concealed excitement. They had not come for the ceremony. They had come for the spectacle. Because everyone in that building had heard the same story. Poor girl, hidden away for years. A face so plain that even her own father kept her out of society. The Duke of Montclair was marrying the ugly Fairchild daughter, and not one person in that cathedral believed he was doing it for any reason other than money. They were right about that part. Henry's hands moved to the edges of the veil. The bride stood beside him completely still, not trembling, not nervous, not even blinking. That stillness unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The priest spoke. "You may lift the veil." Henry's fingers closed around the lace. The entire cathedral stopped breathing. He lifted it, and the world as he understood it simply broke apart, because the woman standing beside him was not ugly. She was extraordinary. Golden candlelight moved across her face like it had been waiting for her. Her chestnut hair was pinned with quiet elegance beneath a crown of tiny pearls. Her green eyes were steady and clear, holding his gaze, without flinching, without shyness, without any of the gratitude he had expected to see there. A woman somewhere behind him dropped something. Someone whispered a name. Someone else said nothing at all, and that silence was louder than every voice in the room. Henry forgot what he was supposed to say next. Eleanor Fairchild looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has just walked into a room they already rearranged. Calmly, knowingly, and then, so softly that only he could possibly hear it, she spoke. "You should have asked why they wanted you to believe the lie." He had no answer. He had no breath. The priest continued. The vows were spoken. The ring was placed. And during the kiss, that brief and formal press of lips that was meant to mean nothing at all, she pressed a folded note into his palm. He did not open it until they were walking back down the aisle. The ink was neat and unhurried. It said, "You married me believing a lie. Tonight, you will learn why. I did not come here to be rescued. I came here with a plan." Henry Montclair had walked into that cathedral believing he was rescuing himself. He had no idea he was walking into something far larger than debt, far larger than a wedding, far larger than anything he had prepared himself for. Hello and welcome to today's story. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If someone spread a lie about you to protect themselves, and it actually worked, would you be angry with them, or would you understand why they did it? Type angry or understand in the comments right now. I want to see where you stand before this story changes how you think about that answer. And if this is the kind of storytelling you enjoy, please subscribe and hit the like button before we begin. It helps this channel more than you know. Now, back to London, back to the rain, back to the man standing at the altar who had no idea what was about to shatter. Chapter 1. The girl. Everyone mocked. 3 weeks before the wedding, a charity event was held in the Fairchild drawing room. It was the kind of event, London, where London's wealthy women gathered to donate small amounts of money and large amounts of opinion. The room was warm and bright and filled with the soft clatter of fine china. A young kitchen maid, carrying a tray of porcelain cups, lost her footing near the doorway. The tray went sideways. The cups hit the floor in a cascade of white and gold. The room went sharp and silent. Every woman in the room turned to look. The poor girl knelt on the floor, her face burning red, her hands shaking as she tried to collect the broken pieces. Nobody moved to help her, nobody except Eleanor Fairchild. She was already crossing the room before anyone else had finished deciding whether to react. She knelt beside the maid on the polished floor without any concern for her dress. "Leave the pieces," she said quietly. "You cut your hand. Let me look at it." The maid stared at her. "Miss, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't," Eleanor said. "None of that matters right now." She helped the girl to her feet, pressed a clean cloth from her own pocket against the small cut on the maid's palm, and spoke softly to her until the shaking stopped. Across the room, behind the rim of a teacup, Charlotte Ashbourne watched all of this with cold amusement. Charlotte was the kind of beautiful that required maintenance, every curl placed deliberately, every smile calculated before delivery. She leaned toward the woman beside her and said, "Just loud enough. I suppose if you have no social engagements of your own, you must fill your time somehow." Soft laughter moved through the nearby cluster of women. Eleanor did not look up. She kept her attention on the maid's hand. On the outside, she appeared unbothered, but Eleanor Fairchild had spent years perfecting that particular expression. Years of learning to hold her face still, while her chest did all the feeling. She was 23 years old, and had not attended a London ball in 4 years. Not because she was ashamed, not because she had no invitation, but because she had made a careful choice to disappear. And disappearing had cost her more than anyone looking at her composed face would ever know. There were mornings she had stood at her bedroom window, watching carriages move through the street below, and felt the particular ache of a person who has removed themselves from a life they were entitled to live. There were evenings she had sat alone in the library, while music drifted from some nearby house, and told herself that safety was worth more than dancing. She believed that. She had to believe it, because the alternative, that she had surrendered years of her own life to the persistence of one man who simply refused to accept her answer, was a thought she could not afford to sit with too long. Society had decided years ago that Eleanor Fairchild was plain, overlooked, and unremarkable. She had let them decide that. She had helped them decide it. The grief of that was hers alone. She had never once shown it to the room. Later that evening, as the last guests left and the house fell quiet, her father found her in the library. Edward Fairchild was a broad-shouldered man with gray in his beard and the look of someone who had worked very hard for a very long time to reach the room he was standing in. He set a letter on the reading table in front of her. "The contract has been signed," he said. "Henry Montclair has agreed to the terms. The wedding is in 3 weeks." Eleanor set down her book. She looked at the letter without touching it. "Is he a good man?" she asked. Her father was quiet for a moment. "He is a man in a difficult position," he said carefully. "He lost a great deal because of his father's choices. He is not cruel. He is cold. There is a difference." Eleanor considered that. "Cold I can work with," she said. Her father looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what you are walking into," he said. It was not a question. "I understand exactly what I am walking into," she said. "That is why I agreed." Edward Fairchild nodded slowly. He did not ask her to explain. He had learned years ago that his daughter always had a reason. He left her alone in the library with the letter and the lamplight, and whatever plan she was quietly finishing inside her head. Eleanor sat for a long time without moving. Then she picked up her pen and wrote 3 sentences in the small leather notebook. She kept on the shelf, beside the window. She did not write his name. She wrote, "He believes I am nothing. He will arrive expecting nothing. That is exactly where I need him to be." She closed the notebook. She looked at the lamp for a while. The truth was, she had studied the Duke of Montclair the way you study something before you depend on it. She had read the society papers carefully. She had spoken at length with her father's solicitor, who knew the state of the Montclair finances in detail. She had asked her father indirect questions about the man's character over several weeks, and listened to the spaces between his answers as much as to the answers themselves. What she had found was this: Henry Montclair had not gambled once in 6 years. He had not kept a mistress. He had dismissed the servants who stole from the household, but had ensured each of them left with enough money to find another position. He had argued quietly and in writing with 3 separate creditors who had attempted to charge interest beyond the legal limit, and he had won all 3 arguments without raising his voice. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had locked himself inside the project of survival and had not looked up in 6 years. Eleanor understood that particular kind of person. She had been one herself. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. And in the dark, before sleep came, she allowed herself one honest thought that she had been keeping back. She hoped he was kind, not because she needed him to be, but because the plan was much easier if he was. And underneath that thought, quieter, the one she would not write in any notebook, she was tired. Tired of planning, tired of surviving, tired of needing a strategy just to move through a world that should have simply let her be. She closed her eyes. She let herself be tired for exactly 1 night. Then she put it away. Chapter 2. The Duke, who trusted no one, Montclair Hall, sat in the hills outside London like a beautiful thing, slowly losing the argument against time. The stone was old and proud. The grounds were wide and carefully kept. But if you looked closely at the east wing, you could see the places where the repairs had stopped, where the money had run out, and the walls had simply been left to make their peace with the weather. Henry sat at his father's desk. He still thought of it as his father's desk, with letters spread across every surface. Creditors' letters, notices of unpaid accounts going back 7 years, polite threats dressed in formal language. He had read them so many times that he no longer needed to unfold them to know what they said. The late Duke of Montclair had loved cards, loved fine horses, loved importing furniture from France at prices that made the servants go pale, loved the appearance of wealth with a devotion he never once applied to the actual building of it. And when he died, he left his son a title, a decaying estate, and a ledger that read like a confession. Henry had been 22. He had stood at his father's grave and made a very simple decision. He would not feel things. Feelings were the reason the Montclair fortune was gone. His father had felt excitement at the card table, had felt certainty about horses that lost every race, had felt pride that cost more than every stone in the hall combined. So Henry chose the opposite. He chose logic. He chose control. He chose the cold, reliable comfort of needing nothing from anyone. His oldest friend, Theodore Ravenshire, arrived the morning before the wedding. Theodore was the kind of man who made even difficult rooms feel warmer simply by standing in them. He sat across the desk and looked at the mountain of letters and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You know, most men hope for something when they marry." "Most men can afford to hope," Henry said without looking up. "The Fairchild girl will be my wife," Henry said. "That is the full extent of my expectation." Theodore was quiet again. Then, They say she's. I know what they say, Henry said. It doesn't matter. Are you certain you don't want to at least? Theodore. Henry finally looked at him. I am not doing this for happiness. I am doing this so that 600 years of my family's name does not disappear because my father couldn't sit still at a card table. That is the only reason. There is no other reason. Please stop looking for one. Theodore sat back. All right, he said. All right, Henry agreed, and returned to the letters. But later, alone, he found himself doing the one thing he had told Theodore he would not do. He found himself thinking about the rumors. Not with cruelty, with something that shamed him slightly, with relief. If she was plain, then the marriage would remain what he needed it be. An arrangement, a transaction, nothing that could grow into something he didn't know how to hold. He folded the last letter. He told himself he was ready. He was not. That night he could not sleep. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling the way a man looks at his ceilings when the thinking is too loud to close, his eyes against. He thought about his father. His father had been a man of tremendous feeling. He had cried at music. He had laughed so hard at bad jokes that tears ran down his face. He had loved his wife, Henry's mother, with the devoted, impractical loyalty of a man who placed one thing above all others and expected the world to rearrange itself around that priority. And when she died, he had grieved in the same total way, completely, without restraint, and then had filled the space she left with cards and wine and horses and furniture from Paris because some wounds are too large to leave open-ends, and some men do not know any other way to close them. Henry had watched all of it. From childhood to inheritance, he had watched his father feel his way through every room and leave a mess in every one. And he had decided at 22, standing at a grave in the rain, that he would be different. He would be the man who did not feel. He would be careful. He would be measured. He would be present in his obligations and absent from everything that could not be put in a ledger. It had worked too. For 6 years, it had worked perfectly. The estate had survived. The debt had slowly, painfully been contained. The name had been preserved. And Henry Montclair had stood at the center of all of it, managing and controlling and needing nothing, and had been almost entirely fine, almost. He pressed his palm flat against the mattress. Tomorrow, one more day and it would be done. He told himself that again, closed his eyes, and did not sleep for a very long time. Chapter 3. The veil lifts. The morning of the wedding arrived the way difficult things often do. Quietly and all at once, Henry dressed without assistance. He had dismissed the valet before the man could finish buttoning his coat. He needed the silence. He stood at the window of his London townhouse for a long time, watching the rain move through the gray streets below, telling himself the same thing he had told himself for weeks. This is practical. This is necessary. This is what must be done. He arrived at St. Bartholomew's Cathedral 20 minutes before the hour. The guests were already seated. He could feel them watching him. From the moment he walked through the great doors, he walked to the altar and stood there and did not fidget and did not scan the crowd for familiar faces. He simply waited. Then the music changed, and every head in the cathedral turned. The figure that appeared at the far end of the aisle moved slowly. She was dressed in ivory and cream, the fabric layered and soft, the veil so thick and long that it completely concealed her face. Henry watched her walk. He noticed first that she walked without hesitation. No shuffling, no glancing at the floor. She moved like a person who knew exactly where she was going and had decided some time ago that she would not be hurried. He found that strange. A woman who had supposedly spent years in hiding, mocked and pitied, and kept out of sight, should have been frightened. Should have been small. This woman was neither. She reached the altar. Edward Fairchild placed her hand in Henry's without ceremony. Her hand was steady. The ceremony moved forward. Vows were spoken. Rings were exchanged. And then the priest said the words the entire cathedral had been waiting for since the moment the invitations arrived. "You may lift the veil." Henry reached for it. Henry reached for it. He was already preparing his expression, already deciding on the appropriate look of polite indifference, already telling himself that whatever he was about to see would not affect him in any direction. He lifted the lace. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of ceremony. It was the silence of a room full of people suddenly uncertain what to do with their faces. Behind Henry, a woman made a small, involuntary sound. Charlotte Ashbourne, seated in the third row with a fan that had been moving lazily all morning, went completely still. Henry did not hear any of it. Henry did not hear anything. He was looking at his wife. He had been told she was plain. He had been told she was hidden away for good reason. He had been told there was nothing remarkable about her at all. Every single word of it was wrong. Her face held the kind of beauty that did not announce itself. It was not the bright, obvious beauty of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was lovely. It was quieter than that. More serious, more real. Her green eyes met his, and they held there, and she did not look away, and she did not smile the way women smiled when they wanted to be admired. She looked at him like she was reading something, like he was a letter she had already opened before, and was simply reviewing again for accuracy. The priest was speaking. Henry could hear the words somewhere at the edge of his awareness. He responded to them correctly. Some part of him was still functioning. But the larger part, the part that had walked in here that morning, so very certain of exactly what this marriage was standing in the rubble of every assumption it had ever made. He kissed her, brief, formal, appropriate, and the moment before she stepped back, something moved from her fingers to his. He kept walking. He kept his hand at his side. He did not open the note until they were halfway down the aisle, and the cathedral had found its voice again, and the music had resumed, and he was surrounded by the sound of people discovering they had been wrong. He unfolded the paper with one hand. 4 sentences. "You married me believing a lie. Tonight, you will learn why. I'd not come here to be rescued. I came here with a plan." Henry folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his coat. He walked through the cathedral doors. The rain had stopped. The sun had appeared over the rooftops in a thin, pale line. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds, squinting up at it, before he accepted the truth. He understood nothing, not a single thing. And for the first time in a long time, that frightened him in a way that felt almost like being alive. Chapter 4. The secret behind the rumor. The wedding carriage was very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that builds itself around 2 people who have many things to say, and are each waiting to see who will speak first. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, watching the city go past through the narrow window. She was not performing composure. She genuinely needed a moment. The cathedral had been harder than she expected. Not the ceremony itself, not the crowd, not the veil, not the weight of 200 pairs of eyes deciding what they thought of her in the span of a single lifted piece of lace. She had prepared for all of that. What she had not prepared for was the way Henry Montclair had looked at her. Not with hunger, not with the particular bright greed of a man, discovering a beautiful woman he had been told was plain. He had looked at her the way a person looks when they have just been told something is true that they had spent a long time hoping was false. Like relief and loss arriving at the same moment, she had not accounted for that. She filed it away without examining it and looked out the window. Henry held the note. He held it for longer than necessary, then set it on the seat beside him. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "I did," she said, not turning from the window. "You have a plan," he said. She turned then. "We both have plans," she said. "Yours was to save the estate. Mine is to stay safe. Neither plan is shameful." Henry was quiet. The carriage moved north out of the city, and the streets widened, and the noise of London gradually fell behind them. "The rumors," he said finally. "Who started them?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I did," she said. He blinked. That was not an answer he had been prepared for. "You spread the story yourself," he said. "That you were plain, that you were hidden, that no man wanted to look at you." "Yes," she said simply. "Why?" "Because the lie protected me from a man who would not accept no," she said. "And if you want to understand the rest of it, you will need to wait until we reach the hall. It is not a short story." Henry said nothing. He sat back. He looked at the woman's sitting across from him, his wife, whom he had known for approximately 4 hours, and tried to reorganize what he thought he understood about the situation. He could not. Montclair Hall appeared through the trees as the afternoon light was beginning to lean. Henry watched Eleanor's face as they came up the drive. He expected polite interest. He expected the careful expression of a woman evaluating what she had purchased. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes moving over the stone and the grounds, and the old oak trees lining the approach, and something in her face softened in a way that seemed genuine and unguarded. "It's beautiful," she said, not for him, to herself, as though she had forgotten for a moment that he was there. The staff was assembled on the front steps. 14 people, all of them watching the carriage with the careful, uncertain expressions of people who had heard too many rumors and too many opinions, and were now revising all of them very rapidly. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, gray-haired, straight-backed, 30 years in service to the Montclair family, stepped forward to greet them. Eleanor went to her directly, not ahead of Henry, beside him. She shook Mrs. Dawson's hand with both of hers and said, "I have heard the house is exceptional. I am hoping you'll tell me everything about it when you have the time." Mrs. Dawson looked briefly startled. Then she smiled in the careful way of a person trying not to show how much they meant it. Henry watched all of this. Then, in the corridor of the east wing, while he was showing Eleanor to her rooms, the thing that changed something in him happened without warning. A young kitchen maid came around the corner, moving too quickly, and collided with a side table. The small oil lamp on the table lurched. Eleanor caught it with one hand before it could fall. The maid was trembling. "I'm so sorry, my lady. I didn't see. It's all right," Eleanor said, and her voice was so even that it seemed to physically steady the girl. "What's your name?" "Rosie, my lady. Rosie. This happens. I promise you it does." She set the lamp straight, then looked at the girl's hands. "Are you hurt?" "No, my lady." "Good. Off you go then." The girl left. Eleanor continued down the corridor as though nothing had occurred. Henry had stopped walking. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, watching the space where that small exchange had happened. He had grown up in this house. He had known Mrs. Dawson since he was old enough to tie his own shoes. He had seen dozens of visitors walk through these halls. Not one of them had ever asked a frightened kitchen maid if she was hurt. He started walking again. Something in his chest had shifted. He was not ready to examine what it was. That evening they sat in the library. The fire had been lit. The house was quiet. Eleanor sat with her hands around a cup of tea and told him. Not everything, not yet, but enough. 3 years ago, she had attended a charity function in the city. A nobleman had seen her across the room. He had sent a card the next day. She had politely declined. He had sent another. She had declined again. And then things had begun to change. The invitations became insistent. The attention became pressure. And then, when she continued to refuse, the pressure became something else entirely. So you disappeared, Henry said. So I made everyone believe I was not worth pursuing, she said. I told my cousin that a man had called me plain. I made sure she repeated it. I stayed home. I dressed plainly on the rare occasions I appeared in public. I gave society nothing to look at. And it worked, he said. For a time, she said. Henry sat with that. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. He was thinking about what it cost a person to build that kind of wall. Wall. To choose invisibility, not because they were afraid of the world, but because one particular part of the world had made itself unsafe. Who is he? Henry asked. Eleanor looked at the fire. His name, she said quietly, is Alexander Blackwood. She said it the way people say the names of things they have hoped for a long time to stop being afraid of. She was not all the way there yet. Chapter 5. Man Who Would Not Let Go. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the wedding. Eleanor was in the small garden at the side of the hall, speaking with the groundskeeper about the rose beds, when the footman brought it to her on a silver tray. She saw the handwriting before she picked it up. She stood very still for one moment. Just one. Then she dismissed the groundskeeper with a quiet word, took the letter, and went inside. Henry found her in the library 30 minutes later. She was seated at the reading table. The letter was on the table in front of her, unopened. She had not touched it. He knows, she said without turning around. Henry came to the table. He looked at the letter. The wax seal was red, and the handwriting on the front was a very specific kind of confident. The penmanship of a man who had never once been told his letters would not be welcome. How did he find out so quickly? Henry asked. He has friends everywhere, she said. He has always had friends everywhere. That has always been part of it. She finally opened the letter. She read it once, her expression completely even. Then she set it on the table face up so Henry could read it. The letter was brief. It offered congratulations on the marriage. It expressed hope that the Duke and his new bride were settling in comfortably. It mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Alexander Blackwood found himself in the area next week and hoped to call on them both. Every word was charming. Every sentence was polished. And, underneath all of it, like a cold current beneath warm water, was something that made the air in the room feel slightly different. Henry set the letter down. "Tell me everything," he said. Eleanor turned to look at him. She studied his face for a moment, deciding something. Then she told him Alexander Blackwood had come from old money and older connections. He was a man who moved through London society like a key through a familiar lock, smoothly, effortlessly, always finding the way open. He was charming at dinner parties. He was generous with invitations. He made people feel selected when he chose to notice them. And when Eleanor Fairchild declined his interest 3 years ago, he had not been angry. That was the most frightening part. He had simply continued. As though her answer had not been a refusal, but a misunderstanding that would eventually correct itself. He had found ways to appear at the same events she attended, had sent gifts she returned, had told mutual acquaintances certain things about her reputation that were not true, but were. Said with such pleasant confidence that they traveled faster than the truth could follow. He convinced people that I was difficult, she said, that I was ungrateful, that I had refused him out of some kind of foolishness rather than clear preference, and because he was charming and connected, and I was a merchant's daughter. More people believed him than believed me. Henry was quiet. That is why you built the rumors, he said. A woman who is plain and hidden gets left alone, she said. A woman who is beautiful and single and unattached is a problem he could keep trying to solve. I removed the problem, but the marriage made you visible again, Henry said. The marriage made me a duchess, she said. I am no longer accessible, and a titled husband changes what is possible for him significantly. Henry stood. He walked to the window. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets for a long moment. There is something else, he said. Something about the contract. Eleanor blinked. You read it carefully, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite surprise but was a small adjustment of expectation. I read everything carefully, he said. Clause 14. If I attempt to abandon you, isolate you, or deny your status as Duchess, the financial arrangements shift significantly. Yes, she said. You entered this marriage prepared for the possibility that I might behave exactly as badly as you expected, he said. I have learned to plan for the worst and be grateful when I am wrong, she said. I was not certain you would be different. And now, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. I am uncertain, she said honestly. I am watching. Henry returned to the table. He picked up Alexander Blackwood's letter. He held it for a moment. Then he set it face down. He may come, Henry said. Let him. He did say it the way a man says something to seem brave. He said it the way a man says something when he has already worked through the thing and arrived at a decision on the other side. Eleanor watched him. She said nothing, but something small and careful began to change behind her eyes. 3 days later, on a cold Thursday afternoon, a black carriage came up the drive at Montclair Hall. Eleanor was standing at the upstairs window. She watched it come. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her face was still, but she gripped her own fingers tightly, just once, just briefly, before she released them and turned away from the glass. She had survived 3 years of his particular kind of persistence. She had built walls and rumors and legal clauses and a marriage to survive it. And still, watching that carriage on the gravel, her hands betrayed her. She straightened her spine. She went downstairs. Chapter 6. The Duke makes his choice. Alexander Blackwood stepped down from the carriage smiling. He was tall, well-dressed, and had the kind of ease about him that looked like confidence from the outside and felt like something harder to name from the inside. He shook Henry's hand in the entrance hall with both warmth and assurance, as though they were old friends reuniting rather than men who had never met. Montclair, he said, what a remarkable place. I had heard good things. Blackwood, Henry said, even and flat. Alexander turned to Eleanor. He looked at her for a moment too long. Eleanor, he said, you look well. He said it with the particular emphasis of someone who meant to remind her that he had always known she was not what she pretended to be. Mr. Blackwood, she said. Not his first name, not Duchess warmth, correct. Formal, unreachable. Several guests had arrived for dinner that evening. Sebastian Ashford and his wife. Victoria Theodore Ravenshire, who had arrived that afternoon and was watching everything from a corner with the alert quiet of a man being paid to observe. And Charlotte Ashbourne, who had apparently received an invitation from Alexander and had arrived with the particular brightness of someone who expects to witness something interesting. Dinner began well enough. The food was good. The conversation was pleasant. And then, during the second course, Alexander began. He did it so smoothly that if you were not watching for it, You might not have recognized it for what it was. He mentioned, gently, that he had known Eleanor in London years ago. Such a quiet life she led then, he said pleasantly, as if this were fond reminiscence. I always thought it was a shame she kept herself apart from society. Victoria Sterling glanced at Eleanor. Eleanor continued eating. The second attack came between the main and the sweet. Alexander mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had heard several accounts of the Fairchild family's social reputation over the years.
Merchants, of course,
he said with a pleasant smile. It must have been quite an adjustment, Eleanor, learning the expectations of a ducal household. A small, mean silence moved through the table. Charlotte covered her mouth delicately. Henry set down his fork. He did not look at Alexander. He looked at Eleanor. She was sitting straight. Her expression was neutral. But her hands in her lap had closed around the napkin the way hands close around something when the rest of you is refusing to react. He had seen that grip before. On the girl in the charity room being mocked by Charlotte Ashbourne. On himself, in front of creditors, holding himself together by the sheer force of not giving them the satisfaction of watching him fall apart. He recognized what it cost. He recognized it very well. The third attack came at the sweet course. Alexander leaned back in his chair with the relaxed air of a man winning a game nobody had announced. I had always assumed Eleanor would remain in her father's house, he said to the table, not to anyone in particular. It was rather unexpected, the marriage. Rushed, some said. Under somewhat unusual circumstances. He left the sentence there, incomplete, decorated with implication. Henry Montclair stood up, not loudly, not abruptly. He simply rose from his chair at the head of the table, and the room went immediately, instinctively quiet. Because he was the Duke, and this was his house, and he had a particular quality when he decided to say something that made every other sound in the room step aside and wait. My wife, he said, came to this house with more grace and more genuine character than any person seated at this table, myself included. She has managed this household with intelligence and warmth since the day she arrived. She has earned every inch of her position as Duchess of Montclair. He looked at Alexander directly. If there are questions about the circumstances of our marriage, I am happy to answer them. There were no unusual circumstances. There was a man in debt and a woman who deserved better than she had been given. I am grateful every day that the agreement was made. He paused, and I will say clearly, in front of everyone at this table, that anyone who chooses to speak about my wife in a manner that is less than respectful will not find a welcome here again. Not at dinner, not at any other hour. He sat down. The table was silent, not awkwardly. The silence of a room where something important has just been decided. Theodore Ravensher lifted his wine glass from his corner of the table. He said nothing. He simply raised it slightly in Henry's direction. Sebastian Ashford cleared his throat and turned to Victoria and asked a pleasant question about their journey, and the evening moved forward. Charlotte set her spoon down and studied her dessert plate with great attention. Alexander Blackwood smiled. It was a different smile than the one he had arrived with. Smaller, the smile of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on was not as solid as he believed. He did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. He was recalculating. Eleanor could see it. She had spent 3 years learning to read him, and she knew exactly what that particular stillness meant. He was not finished. He was simply deciding what to try next. After dinner, as the guests were shown to their rooms, Eleanor paused in the corridor outside the dining room. Henry was behind her. She turned. She looked at him. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, You did not have to do that. I know, he said. He is not finished, she said quietly. I want you to understand that. Tonight changed his method. It did not change his intention. Henry looked at her. I know that too, he said. She held his gaze. Then we need to be ready, she said. We, he repeated. It was not a question. She had said it without thinking, and they both noticed. Yes, she said, after a moment. We. Henry stood in the corridor alone after she had gone. The house was settling around him. The old familiar sounds of wood and stone adjusting to the night, the low burn of the wall lamps, the distant closing of doors. He had not planned to say what he said at the dinner table. He had not rehearsed a single word of it. He had sat through the first insult and told himself it was social friction. Nothing he needed to involve himself in. He had sat through the second and told himself that Eleanor was composed and capable and did not require him to intervene. Both of those things were true. And then he had seen her hands close around the napkin in her lap. That small, controlled, invisible grip of a person holding themselves together from the inside. And something inside him had stopped negotiating with itself. He had simply stood. He walked slowly back toward his study. He was not the man his father had been. His father had loved, loudly and badly, and at great cost to everyone around him. Henry had decided he would love nothing. It had taken exactly 9 days of living in the same house as Eleanor Fairchild to prove that decision wrong. He was not ready to say the word yet, but he was an honest man. And he knew the difference between duty and whatever had gotten him to his feet at that dinner table. Duty had kept him seated through far worse. Chapter 7. The second move, Alexander Blackwood left the next morning before breakfast. No farewell, no note. Only the sound of wheels on gravel, and then silence. Eleanor stood at the upstairs window and watched the carriage go. She did not feel relief. She had expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt the particular alertness of a person who has been in danger long enough to know that silence is not the same as safety. Henry appeared in the doorway behind her. He's gone, he said. Yes, she said. You don't look relieved. He will send something, she said. A letter, a rumor, something through a mutual connection that arrives softly and does damage quietly. That is how he operates. She turned from the window. He has never once made a move you could point to directly. That is what makes him difficult. Henry was quiet. Then, what does he want? Ultimately, Eleanor looked at him steadily. Control, she said. He wants to be the reason things happen. He wanted me to come to him eventually because I had no other options. The marriage closed that particular door, and he is now deciding which wall to come through instead. Henry sat down in the chair near the window. He looked at the grounds below for a moment. Your father's solicitor, he said. The contract clause. You built that because you expected the worst from me. Yes, she said. What else did you build? He asked. What other protections? She studied him. This was the part she had not planned to share. Not yet. Not until she was more certain. But he had stood at that dinner table. He had said those words in front of all those people, without being asked. He had looked at her afterward, not as a man, expecting gratitude, but as a man who had simply done what seemed correct, and was now waiting to see what came next. She made a decision. I kept copies, she said, of every letter he sent me during those 3 years. I kept the names of witnesses who saw certain incidents. I kept records of the rumors he spread and the people he told them to. I have a considerable amount of documentation of a man whose behavior, if made visible, would end his standing in London society. Henry looked at her. You built a case, he said. I built an ending, she said. I just needed to reach a position from which I could use it safely. A duchess, he said. A duchess with a husband willing to stand behind her, she said. Those are different things. A long silence moved through the room. Then Henry said, "Show me what you have." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the locked drawer of the writing desk in the corner of the room. She removed a leather folio. She set it on the table between them. They spent the next 2 hours going through it together. Every letter, every witness account, every name. Henry read without interrupting. He read carefully and completely the way he read everything, and when he was finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said, "This ends him. If delivered correctly," she said, "through the right person. Someone whose word carries sufficient weight that it cannot be dismissed." Henry thought for a moment. Then, "I know someone." He looked at her. "Lord Hargrove," he said. "He sits on 3 charitable committees. He was a personal friend of your father's. He's possibly the most respected man in London, and he has despised Alexander Blackwood for 7 years over a separate matter I happen to know about." Eleanor went very still. "You have known Lord Hargrove this entire time," she said. "I have," he said. "And you didn't think to mention?" "You didn't ask," he said simply. "And I didn't know, until 48 hours ago, what kind of problem we were dealing with." She stared at him. Then unexpectedly, she laughed. It surprised them both. It was a short, genuine, unguarded laugh, the kind that escapes when a person has been holding themselves tightly together for too long. And something finally strikes them as absurdly, perfectly right. Henry looked at her. Something happened in his face that he did not try to conceal. "We could have shortened this considerably," she said. "We could have," he agreed. "Send word to Lord Hargrove," she said. "I'll write today," he said. She stood. She picked up the leather folio and held it for a moment. 3 years of careful, lonely documentation. 3 years of collecting evidence in a locked drawer, and hoping that someday she would reach a position safe enough to use it. She set it back on the table. "Keep it here," she said. "We'll need it soon." Henry nodded. She walked to the door. She paused. "Henry," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. Not for the dinner table, not for any one thing. For all of it, he understood. "You're welcome," he said. She left. He sat alone with the folio and the quiet morning light and the particular feeling of a man who spent 6 years managing a crisis alone and has just discovered, with some bewilderment, that he is no longer alone. He found it was not as frightening as he had expected. Chapter 8. No More Lies. It was very late. The house was completely quiet in the particular way that large old houses become quiet at the end of long days, deeply, thoroughly settled. The library was lit by the fireplace and one lamp on the reading table. Eleanor was on the window seat with a book she had not turned a page of in some time. Henry came in, without knocking, then stopped when he saw her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought you'd gone to bed." "I couldn't sleep," she said. He came in anyway. He sat in the large chair by the fire. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire burned. The house breathed. Outside, somewhere in the dark gardens, an owl called once and then went quiet. Henry spoke first. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want you to know it is not for any particular reason. I want you to know." "Tubbs," Eleanor set the book down. "I married you because I had no choice," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I came to the cathedral with a set of expectations that were unkind. Not deliberately, but unkind." "I know," she said quietly. "I expected nothing," he said. "I told myself that was logical, that it was safer." He looked at the fire. "I was wrong," he said. And I was wrong long before the dinner table. I was wrong the moment you knelt on the floor in that corridor to ask a frightened kitchen maid if she was hurt. Eleanor looked at him. I watched you do that, he said. And I thought this is the kind of person who makes the world slightly better just by moving through it. And I didn't know what to do with that, because I had spent a great deal of time deciding that I wouldn't notice things like that. I noticed anyway, he said. The fire crackled. A long moment passed. Then Eleanor said, I came into this marriage expecting to be managed, to be tolerated. I had made a plan, and the plan was good, and I was proud of it, and I told myself that was enough, that I did not need anything more than safety and distance and a title that would keep a certain person away from me. Was it enough? He said. I thought it was, she said. Until I arrived here, and there was something about the way this house looks in the late afternoon, and the way Mrs. Dawson's and Saratine. Dawson talked about it like it was a person she loved, and the way you stood at your father's desk with all those letters, and carried the whole thing on your own. She paused. I thought you were cold, she said. My father said you were cold, but not cruel. He was more right than he knew. You are not cold. You are careful. There is a difference. Henry looked at her. She looked back. Not the way she had looked at him in the cathedral, reading him, measuring. Differently. The way people look at each other when the assessment is finished. And something else has started. I never expected protection, she says. I planned for every possible version of this, and I never once planned for a man who would stand up at his own dinner table and say those things in front of all those people. Or sit across from me for 2 hours going through 3 years of evidence, once making me feel as though I had done something wrong by needing to collect it. You did nothing wrong, he said simply. I know that, she said, but it matters that you know it too. The lamp on the reading table cast a long, yellow light across the floorboards. The fire had settled into coals. The room was warm and honest and very quiet. I don't know how to do this, Henry said, and his voice was different, lower, less composed, the voice of a man putting down something heavy. I spent a long time deciding that needing things was dangerous, that caring about things was what got people into trouble. I watched my father love the wrong things and lose everything, and I decided the safest choice was to need nothing. That is a very lonely way to live, she said softly. Yes, he said. It is. Eleanor stood. She walked to the fireplace. She stood looking at the coals for a moment. Then she turned. I don't want a cold arrangement, she said. I thought I did. I convinced myself I did, but I don't. Neither do I, he said. He stood. He was close now, near enough that the firelight moved between them. Then we try something different, he said. Both of us. Both of us, she agreed. He reached out. His hand found hers in the low orange light. Her fingers closed around his. No calculation, no strategy. Just two people who had spent a great deal of time building walls, finally standing on the same side of one. They stood there together for a long time. They did not need to say more. Some things are complete before they are spoken. Some truths live best in silence, in the warmth of a room at the end of a long day, in the steady pressure of a hand that has chosen to hold rather than let go. The bells of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral rang on a bright Saturday morning. And this time they rang for a christening. Lord Hargrove had received the leather folio 3 weeks after Henry sent word. He had read it over 2 evenings. On the 3rd day, he had made 4 visits in 1 afternoon. Within a fortnight, Alexander Blackwood had resigned from 2 committees, declined a 3rd appointment. He had expected to receive, and announced that he would be spending the foreseeable future at his country estate, attending to personal matters. He sent no farewell. He sent no letters. London society, which runs on the fuel of other people's falls, discussed it briefly and moved on. The small school had opened in the village below Montclair Hall. Eleanor had designed the curriculum herself. She had raised the funds through the charitable foundation. She established in the first spring of her marriage. She had overseen the construction and hired the teachers and visited every week without fail. The families of the village called her the Good Duchess, not because she was dutiful, because she was present. Henry had restored the East Wing. He had settled the last of his father's debts with a transaction so clean and final that he had stood at his desk afterward, for a long time, looking at the empty ledger, not entirely certain what to do with the feeling that moved through him. Theodore Ravensholt him. Later it was called relief. Henry said he knew that. Theodore said, "You look like a man who didn't know it until just now." Henry had laughed. He laughed more now. It startled Mrs. Dawson the first few times. She had never heard it. In 25 years of service. On a warm Tuesday in late spring, Henry and Eleanor walked the lower gardens after dinner. The gardens had been replanted that season. Eleanor had redesigned the rose beds with the groundskeeper, and the result was something that looked as though it had always been there, as though it had simply been waiting for the right hands to notice it. They walked slowly. They did not always speak. That had become one of the things Henry valued most. The comfortable silence of a person you no longer needed to perform in front of. Eleanor stopped by the old oak at the edge of the east garden. She looked back at the hall. The evening light was doing that particular thing. In times, it sometimes did in the late spring, falling sideways across the stone, turning it honey gold, making the whole building look young again. "Do you remember the day we arrived?" she said. "I remember all of it," he said. "I thought," she said, "that if I could just be safe, that would be enough. I thought I had traded everything else for safety, and that was a reasonable exchange." She turned to look at him. "I had no idea," she said, "that you came with the bargain." He looked at her, his wife, the woman who had walked into a cathedral, a stranger, and walked out a partner, who had stood still under the veil while London decided what to think of her, who had built a wall from rumor and shadow to keep herself safe, and then had quietly taken it down, brick by brick, in the library and the corridors, and the firelit evenings of this house that was now theirs, who had kept 3 years of evidence in a locked drawer, not out of bitterness, but out of the quiet, determined intelligence of a person who refused to be powerless. "Neither did I," he said. He took her hand. She held it. Behind them, Montclair Hall stood in the evening light, restored, inhabited, alive, in a way it had not been in a very long time. Not because the debt was settled, not because of the East Wing was repaired, but because inside it, in the rooms, and the library, and the kitchen, where Rosie no longer trembled when she turned a corner, something had been built that was harder to see than stone and more permanent than money. Trust, chosen carefully, given slowly, and held. London had spent years deciding who Eleanor Fairchild was. It had decided she was plain, and overlooked, and hidden, and pitied. It had built a story from rumor, and repeated it until the rumor became the kind of truth that gets passed between drawing rooms as fact. And in the end, as is always the case with stories built from rumor, the real thing was different. She had never needed to be rescued. She had needed to be seen. Not the version of her that society invented, not the beauty revealed beneath the veil, not the clever plan and the hidden contract clause and the years of quiet survival. The person underneath all of it, the woman who knelt on floors without worrying about her dress, who asked kitchen maids if they were hurt, who loved old stone houses the way other people loved living things, who had kept 3 years of evidence in a locked drawer and carried it alone, without bitterness, until she found the one person she could finally hand it to, who had made peace with the world's unkindness without once letting it make her unkind. She had been seen by a man who had not known he was capable of it until she made it impossible to look away. And that, in the end, was the only story that mattered. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Now I want to go back to the question I asked at the beginning. If someone spread a lie about you to protect themselves, would you be angry or would you understand? Has your answer changed? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please like this video. It takes 1 second and it tells me exactly what kind of stories to bring you next. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the right time. There are more stories coming. Stories about people who were overlooked, underestimated, and quietly extraordinary. Stories like this one. Until next time.